just get
Okay, so I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I live. I'm located on the lands of the Wurundjeri here in Melbourne, as is Cathy. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also honour and acknowledge the continuation of cultural, spiritual, and educational practices of First Nations people of our country. So the Q&A is going to be open during this session, and you're welcome to drop questions into the Q&A. Cathy's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end to respond to questions. I also want to acknowledge the emotional labour that we all do as parents and carers supporting children and young people who are often quite distressed and not having a good time at school and are sometimes mentally unwell. You may find yourself feeling some big feelings today as you listen to Cathy speak. Please do take care of yourself. If you need to take a break from the presentation, please do. It's being recorded. You can finish watching it later. At the end of the presentation, I'll display some crisis numbers. It can be quite distressing to realise that your child has perhaps been struggling with undiagnosed learning difficulties for some time. I want to remind you that as parents, we are all doing the best that we can with the knowledge, supports, and resources that we have access to. And we hope that this series of webinars that we have planned for the rest of this year will help you to access information that might help in your journey as you support your child. Learning difficulty has been a part of my daughter's journey. We discovered that she had learning difficulties when she was in her early primary years. She's now at year 11 age, turning 17 next month. She struggled to learn to read and write when she was I think we first realised, I noticed some anxiety around reading in prep, in foundation, but in grade 1, 2, it became increasingly obvious that there was something going on. And Cathy was a significant help to me personally in helping us get oriented in this space and learn what we needed to know about learning difficulties so that we could put supports in place. I also want to, so I'm going to hand over to Cathy. Cathy has many years of experience, and I'm excited that she's here to be able to share with us today. So Cathy, I'll stop sharing and then you can share your screen and I'll end the poll so that there is. Okay.
perfect.
And
Thank
if I
you,
can.
Tiffany, for that little introduction. And I'm truly very grateful for the invitation to come and speak to School Can't. Certainly, as Tiffany indicated, our relationship has been over a number of years, but it's something that I'm seeing more and more families, schools, and certainly the educators are getting more curious, but the parents are the ones that are driving it. So it's no surprise that here I am today. Just a little bit about me, I think, as a starting point. So, I'm the director at Rookery Road, which is a small intervention service that's based in Spotswood in the inner west of Melbourne. And we are growing, but we're also diversifying the support and navigating different focuses for our family and clientele. Usually, families will come to us with a question. They may not have a set diagnosis. They might be just curious or they're a bit stuck in knowing where to go, and we take them through a process. But usually, families will be wanting some sort of level of intervention, whether that be some literacy support or some math support, maybe even advocacy. And currently, we're servicing about 150 to 160 students. Sometimes it creeps up, but it's around that. And there's 13 educators that are on the team. The story about Rookery Road, and lots of people ask me about our branding being the Emperor Penguin. And quite often, when I was starting the business, it was like trying to think of an animal or an image or a concept that really would strike and resonate with families that who is out there struggling perhaps on their own, feeling isolated and on a slippery slope. And somehow these amazing emperor penguins, and as the picture is showing you, they get together and literally form this huddle around their little chicks. And it's not just one, it's this whole community that comes together. And that was just when I put that connection of what the story of what I was offering, it was like, it has to be that. And so we definitely are prioritizing students who may be suffering a really challenging time or families who are feeling isolated and perhaps on the outer in a school community. Again, coming back to where the families in school can't, we can kind of get together and form this collaboration together to really form a solid base for students and the children, and certainly looking at not just trying to make them survive, we're wanting them to have a thriving and successful life. So whatever the smaller part might be for us, families might come and go, but it's a journey, and we're certainly a small part of those 150 families at the moment, and it might be others in the future. What I thought that we would look at today, and very grateful for the 45 minutes that my background is as an education teacher and working in a school with from adults with disabilities to through to school age children through to early intervention. So from 0 to 6, I had a time over in London working in a school that only specialised in children who had neurodiversity and learning difficulties. And there's about a million stories, and Tiffany certainly knows when I get started, it's like, oops, my 45 minutes might be a little short, but I will try to capture all of my experience, what I have to share in one case study today. So if there's more, we'll have to have a think about how to do that. And certainly there was 4 kind of key questions and components that we thought that we really wanted to cover, was looking at the signs, the steps, who can help. And I've put up their IEP goals, but I don't think I'm actually going to touch base on that. It's really what's that next step. But I think that it could be a navigational point for some of you, and there might be some questions. And then certainly at the end to have a Q&A. Just for protection, this young man that I'm wanting to share today, whilst his name actually is Mason, I have divulged and tried to protect as much of his identity as in the other sort of description. But it was more, I needed to keep his name the same because I knew that I'd start saying one kid's name and then it would end up being who it was. So I've got permission to share his name, and we'll see where we go. As Tiffany indicated too, that I think that there's some of the information that may come through today. You might find yourself saying, yes, this is a child that I know. And for some of you as parents, you might be thinking, this is my child. So just as Tiffany indicated, I feel that there's an acknowledgement that you may be finding yourself in a similar position, that you are equally as floundered as this mum was. But it being, I guess, my assurance at the start is that there is options and there's a really clear pathway forward. So Mason was the middle child of 3, and he was in grade 3 when the mum really started to notice the difficulties that were coming to hand. And there was a lot of really interesting things about him. He was very active. He was always outside. He's always playing sport. He was quite obsessed with baseball and his AFL. And then the mum was actually just noticing what was happening on the side, that he just didn't quite want to engage with books. He was happy to be read to, but he wasn't certainly interested to read them. And there was a real difference that was starting to happen with what she noticed between Mason and her older child. But she couldn't quite work it out, other than it just didn't seem to be clicking for this young person. He would get very upset when she tried to assist him with his homework and would come out with things, the classic cliche of, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, this is all too hard, I don't want to do this. And it became a very stressful and escalated situation for the mum to navigate in all of the journey. And then she'd go back to the school and sort of share some of that distraction. But it was kind of like, oh, he's doing okay. He doesn't really finish his work so often, and he's a really good kid. He's a bit cheeky, and but he's doing okay. And the mum was increasingly kind of not marrying the two together and seeing this real, there was like two different children. And when her son would come at home at the end of the day, he was exhausted and he was emotional. Perhaps you might be familiar with the terms. He was so unregulated and would just then lash out with the siblings, and it would become a whole stressful situation, and then the cycle would just continue. And it increasingly became more difficult to get him to school. But there was this component that he was so social and loved sport, number one. And whenever PE was on, obviously he would get himself to school, and that wasn't the issue. There was a whole lot of nagging feelings that this mum was having, and almost like questioning some of her own doubts about maybe I'm overlooking something, maybe he's going to grow out of it. And so just, that inner dialogue and the anguish between what is actually happening. This mum would attend all of the meetings and always be asking the right questions and trying to look at what sort of supports there could be. But they were always sort of a bit vague. He's a bit behind. Lots of boys are. It's kind of okay. We'll just keep encouraging him to just keep going without really a lot of indication with let's change things. Let's perhaps look at why this might be happening. Or certainly no one was noticing this discrepancy for this young man. He loved maths. That was a standout, and his skill set in that problem solving and solution and mathematics, it was not a bother, but it was becoming more obvious for mum to see that difference. She left it for another 2 years, and when he got to grade 5, it was those NAPLAN results, the dreaded NAPLAN coming through. And without knowing how some of you may feel about NAPLAN, but it was an independent piece of information that was separate from school, and it was glaringly obvious for her. Her son's scores were up with the dots right at the top for the math, and for his literacy, the dots were right down the bottom. And she just felt this just doesn't make sense. And so she needed to get more information. And I think that it was wrangling with her that it was only about a year and a half by that stage for her son to go to high school. And how was he going to cope? The workload was going to increase, the content, the volume of reading, etc. And, panic really started to kick in. She went to her GP to try to find out what should she do, and unfortunately for her, again, she was sort of dismissed that it's maybe we'll just monitor things, we'll just see how things are going, knowing that this is a child who's in grade 5, and there's been enough evidence that the monitoring and the school reports had been consistently putting Mason way behind his age for literacy skills. And so I think that sometimes when you're looking at those school reports, when it's indicating that there might be their 6 month to 12 months, being aware of like, well, where does that actually fit in time? Has this been a persistent and ongoing difficulty? And if that's the case, like this mum hadn't really cared to really take notice of that. It was the NAPLAN data that actually kind of hit her over the head to think, I need to do something. And not being disrespectful to her GP or other people in that process, she knew that there was almost like they were being kind, but just wanting to need to go forward with something different. She needed an expert in the advice. It was very pleasing on our behalf, and the relationship formed. Julie saw a Instagram post for us for Rookery Road, and so she reached out and asked for an initial consult and just to talk it through. The situation when families come and let them share their stories, it's almost for the first time somebody is genuinely sitting down and taking time to listen. And whilst I do love talking, and I did certainly share a lot of information in that session, but it was being heard really for the first time. And as you can imagine, there was just floods of tears, plenty of tissues, because she knew that she was in the right place, that was somebody who was going to help support navigate that whole next part. So we went through the consultation and really kind of just trying to get an understanding of what was the profile, or what was the components, what was his memory like. Tell me a little bit more about his reading skills, or as I said before, she had shared that he loved to be read to but didn't like reading. His spelling was poor. His writing, he just would refuse to do any writing. And but the other beautiful thing was like she was able to share how thoughtful he was at home, how he really wanted to engage with his siblings and be involved, and the family were very active in his sporting choice of interest. So there was this real strength base compounded with these gaps or perhaps weaknesses, as you might indicate. And it really felt that I needed to show her this journey, what she could do as that next sort of step, and wanted to give her a plan that there were options ahead and how did she could navigate some of that. I had asked her quite gently, and sometimes I think that I wade into that on a very case by case situation, whether there is a family history of a learning difficulty, and she'd sort of given me a little bit of information about that. And so I felt encouraged to ask her a little bit more. And it came out that her husband's brother was, in fact, dyslexic. And also, the grandfather absolutely hated school and left early, not being able to read. So there was a real clear case of information sort of presenting that there was a discrepancy, that there was some family history, there were some real hallmarks of strengths in amidst of all of those gaps. So we went through some of those discussion points and where that sat. And at the end, I'm going to send through a link, or I might get Tiffany to perhaps, I was going to send this to you earlier, Tiffany. And I think if I pause myself to do it, I'm going to get muddled. But if you could bring up on the side the Ausspelled guide, the free Ausspelled guide for families, and to pop that into the chat. This was just a really great starting point, like, because where do you begin? And it's knowing it was so overwhelming. There's a lot of information, and I just wanted to narrow it down. And so this is was a really great place. And I think that it's about on page 7 that it just went through some of those characteristics and some of those consistent features. And she was sort of agreeing, thinking, I think this is Mason. From there, I had recommended for her to have a profile done. And so to really put his literacy skills under the microscope and look at some of his reading, the spelling, his letter sound, and matching it to the graphemes or the letters and the sounds and how they go together, getting a sample of his writing and really presenting it almost not as a diagnosis that this is a child with dyslexia or not. It was just to show the mum and certainly this young man, these are your strengths and these are the gaps. And if these are the gaps, then we're going to try to work on those and see if we can boost them. Or if there's some things that I think that might be tricky to actually navigate before you get to high school, what accommodations could we start thinking about that might support that in a way? And so there was a real openness and a combined connection between this young person, his mum, and I. From there, we were able to request a meeting at the school, and we went through my recommendations and the summary, and that was quite well received. But it's something like this that was coming sort of through. So, as I said, I wasn't indicating that he had that he had dyslexia, but it was this kind of spiky profile. His communication skills were exceptional. He was very quick-witted, savvy. He was creative. He had, as I indicated, that problem solving and the mathematical ability. And certainly, he's such a charismatic young person. But the discrepancy with those other areas that I've indicated down the bottom of that picture, it was just presenting this is something that we've got to work on. How do we not just take the areas that are difficult down the bottom, but actually how do we enhance those skills that are actually superior? So again, really trying to lead it with a strength base as a model. Talking to the school about Mason was quite interesting, and there was certainly a real willingness to become involved, and they looked at sort of being able to present more visuals and being able to be a little bit more explicit in their classroom and the instruction. They actually took on board the opportunity to do some audio books for him instead of reading a novel. And he loved that as well. And knowing that there's certain aspects that you can change the speed up to make it faster so he could get through it quicker, which that was just quite revolutionary. And then we also started to trial voice to text. knowing again, as I indicated, that his oral literacy was really superior and he could talk, very fast. And so being able to play with that, the punctuation didn't come, but being able to use things like assistive technology to dictate his stories, again, just opened up the potential to see what he could achieve. Meanwhile, the behaviour was still there because that had been quite learnt, and he really relished the role of being the class clown and distracting everybody and being on top of the list to go to the principal's office or be sent out of the classroom. It was a bit of pride for this young man. However, by the end of grade 6, when I had another discussion with the mum prior for him going into high school, it was becoming obvious that he had made quite a lot of progress, which was awesome. However, it wasn't probably the rate that what I would expect if there was no underlying difficulty, and knowing that if it was something like, it wasn't for this timing for this young person, but a lot of the families that I'm seeing now, it's like when they went through COVID, there was a period that things just weren't, that everything just stopped. So what were children not getting the right instruction or enough of the correct instruction? But for this man, he had just learnt that there was too much power in commanding the class. And so he totally owned that. We're speaking to the mum about what accommodations we could consider and the adjustments. I felt that was going to be really critical because he was still quite significantly behind for his age. And so he went off and had a clinical educational psychology assessment that confirmed that. So an educator like myself can't do that. You need to have formal tests, and there's a real process in going through that. But he was able to bring that through. And the thing that was just so remarkable was not just the mum and I and thinking, yep, okay, got that, check, this is going to be great. We can go into school with a different view and how we can modify it. The young man that I'm talking about, and I'm almost emotional about this because it was so extraordinary. He had this revelation he didn't need to be a class clown anymore, and that he wasn't in fact dumb. And he had this opportunity going into year 7 to reinvent himself. And that was just so remarkable. And certainly I can't pretend that his next few years were there weren't difficulties. There was certainly a number of significant areas that had happened during his high school time, but we knew what we were dealing with, and we were able to challenge the why. And we kept fighting for all sorts of different things and really being able to support this young man. And then when he got to year 10, he kind of really kicked into, he knew what he wanted to do. And so really pulled out some of those stops as to the next step. The mum had disclosed to me that she wished that she had trusted her gut earlier. And I think that's something that a lot of parents feel a guilt that, why didn't I see it earlier? Why didn't I notice this sooner? I should know. I'm the closest person to him, etc. But it's irrelevant. And I'll say this often, and probably every time I see families, that it's your journey up to this point. You only know what you know. But when you're ready to go down that path, there's there's lots of opportunities from moving forward at that point of time. I'm sure that's something Tiffany has talked about a lot previously, or would take up that opportunity to go through that further. But it's almost being able to, the empowerment of knowledge in how to help this young man. The end of his story is not finished. He's now 23. He has a scholarship in his chosen sport, and he's living abroad and living his best life. And so it's quite remarkable. And yeah, I stay in touch with him from time to time. I think that what I'd like to share, that it's recapping some of that and knowing we've already eaten up how much of our time. So I'm hoping that I won't race through this component, but I think that there's a number of components of my story that every family that we see, there's a truth or there's a similarity that comes through, and it's kind of like a fairly, everyone's going to be unique, of course, and there's going to be slightly different signs that might be there. And it may even be that they're not actually 100% in the accuracy, but it's certainly worthwhile checking it out if they persist. And that's my sort of message, that if there's been this persisting ongoing difficulty with some of those things, I think that it's definitely worthwhile having that explored by whoever is that next step. I think that oops, I'm just going to go here. So perhaps some of those first steps can be thinking about what is that relationship with your child's teacher. And I know that that's slightly counterintuitive, or maybe it's contradictory to what I've just highlighted in this story. And I'm sure that there's many of you here that have actually started with talking to your child's teacher. But it's something that I definitely encourage that families still persist and try. And whilst it might not be the class teacher, maybe it's a previous teacher, maybe it's one of the welfare educators, maybe it's you've got a closer relationship with, it might be one of the leadership team. And so I think that it's knowing, my point being that it's actually just being able to share your observation or get them to share see if there's any parallel with that and what you might be able to pick up. Again, as I've indicated, seeing your GP, it's something that we at Rookery Road are wanting to develop and partner with more GP services and to be able to identify features of dyslexia, what can be done as a starting point, and trying to avoid, a lot of families unfortunately go down many rabbit holes and find themselves in dead ends, or find a service and that this is actually a crackpot and there's no evidence backing it, or it might be you've spent thousands of dollars and then still things are not progressing, or you perhaps still haven't been quite heard. It is a trick to try to find a service like ours. And certainly, I think that I'm going to perhaps try to put something together, Tiffany, that I haven't presented in this slides, but just almost like what to look for. And I know certainly from the Dyslexia Victoria page, I think they have a list of like key questions to look out for a reputable service or a provider. There's certainly a number of people out there with goodwill and they are lovely. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I'm sure that you already know you'll have a person that you're thinking about. But as soon as you meet them, you can tell they're not quite marrying up with what you have already gone and investigated, or what you feel is necessary. And it's unfortunately the like of when we go to a hairdresser or a back masseur or wherever, sometimes that first person isn't always the right one straight away. And that's the unfortunate nature. But when you find that right person, you just hold on to them and you continue. This last one about keeping notes, and certainly it's not just the notes of what you're noticing, but sometimes if there's a report, or perhaps you have gone on to the stage of getting an assessment, or there might be some other information, being able to kind of collate it and keep it in a something together. Guaranteed, if this is a journey for you, we're wanting to look for evidence as for children as they're getting older and progressing through, that this has been an ongoing difficulty. And I have to admit that I'm not always the best organised, but I love the idea of telling people to be organised, but I have to master that myself. But it's knowing there will come up, have you got that? Where's that report from such and such? Or where was that IEP document? Oh, dang, where is it? And then you go scrambling. And that can be almost like quite upsetting in itself. I think sometimes even navigating through meetings, that they can be quite emotional, and at times the emotion, you just want to blurt that out, as opposed to having your factual knowledge of, where these notes might sit. This is what I'm seeing, and it brings you back to, and it's almost like it's more concrete in, this is what's happening, this is what I'm seeing, and you're able to refer to some of those bullet points. Where to go to for help, as we've sort of indicated that there's a number of professionals, and I'll let you all just read through where that sits. So where the team at Rookery Road is, we classify ourselves as educational specialists and certainly not as a generic tutor. There'll be a lot of services that are out there, and there's a lot that are very slick in their marketing and promotion, and they might even use the words dyslexia or ADHD, or we're neurodiverse friendly. But it's being able to ask those questions just a little bit further about, well, how do they support them? What kind of programs might they use? What what do they actually know about these areas? And hopefully you can get sort of behind the gimmicking advertisements and being able to find your right professionals. As I indicated too, there is a lot of allied health team, so like the educational psychologists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, and certainly social work are a great support and a good starting point too that are out there. And there certainly is a number of pediatricians who have got speciality in confirmations with ADHD and autism. And it's almost like for me, the takeaway is just getting that talking and asking the question and being able to progress rather than leaving it with your own anguish inside your belly. So, specific learning difficulties as a whole, when we're talking about things like dyslexia, it's usually it will impact on either one area or more than one area. And it's not unusual for some children who have a diagnosis of autism or ADHD already that comes through a little bit later that there's something like dyslexia. It's reinforcing that message that it is not at all related to a child's intelligence. And quite frankly, most of the kids that I'm seeing, they actually have gifts, the most ordinary people. And so we know that intelligence is not at all a component that's impacted. There was a slide that I present sometimes to schools about there's some prominent people who are in our communities, the likes of Jamie Oliver, or it might be Richard Branson, or there might be Cher, or there's a whole plethora of celebrities. And sometimes the kids will say when, they get a diagnosis, oh, does that mean I'm going to be rich and famous too? And it's like, no. So it, it might be. So if you do and you remember me, then can we keep in touch? But it's not a guaranteed pathway, but it's something that it is quite interesting where that sort of fits. So, dyslexia is a component that is relating predominantly to the acquisition of word or the reading ability. So, we see it pop up in things like when kids are finding it hard to do that early decoding and sounding. It's quite effortful. It might be even just that if they're actually okay with the reading, but the pace is quite behind. It's kind of a bit of a hallmark. And I haven't put on here, but it usually pops up. Some of the kids can mask that reading difficulty up to grade 3. And then it's kind of when it's then grade 3 to 5, it will surface in what we see in their writing. So they've actually been able to learn to read, but this component with the difficulty with word from the spelling and the sentence composition and then the whole essay construction, it's like, oh, yeah, that's where I will see it. It becomes really obvious. Dysgraphia is quite specific to the writing. So it's about a difficulty with the graphing and it's the making of a mark. For some students, this would be looking at their hand and their handwriting, or it sometimes can appear. I've heard people comment that it looks a bit scratchy, like a chicken note on there. I think I see such a mixture that it's not just that, but it's this struggle to be able to compose with their hand. And I'm not seeing so much of the other difficulties, certainly the earlier aspects from a reading and that component or the comprehension side. But some of those hallmarks that I've indicated on the page, like with the spacing or copying from the board, it's almost like you being able to do that. You've got two different pieces of information. They can become very fatigued, or they'll become frustrated, or they're almost willing to give most things a go. But with writing, it's a real pushback, and it's such a laborious component to get them involved. And so again, that's becoming, and for a lot of kids, it's even, they've got lots of ideas. And I hear this come up that they're so creative, they just don't know where to start. And it just becomes like that's such a common thing. And it's like they're really clever, but where do we begin? Where do they begin? The dyscalculia being the difficulty with calculations, or it's that number. And so where things of even really basic components. And I shouldn't say that they're basic, because if you don't know how to do it, it's not basic at all. It's just hard. But things like early number facts or things like timetables, you just have to learn it. You just have to do it. And it's like, man, this is just too hard. I don't know how to do it. There becomes an anxiety or an association with math. It might be things like even when you'll see kids, or I see a lot of these kids, it'll be like, can you add 23 and 5? And they get their fingers out. And this is maybe a year 7 student, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. They still are using their hands. And it's almost like that's not age appropriate, but they still need the concrete materials. And so that can be even a little clue, like as to where that might be fitting. Things like analog and digital clocks, analog time is almost an impossibility. And so that can be another really strong indicator that there's a number association with where that fits. And so there's some of these sort of features. And going back to that Ausspell guide, there's a longer list of some of these indicators. Executive function often overlays or underlays a lot of these areas of specific learning difficulties. And I think that possibly some of these may be relevant or seen again in the children who have got ADHD or even autism, or the anxiety that it's almost, how do I even unpack? I know how to do the task, but I just don't know how to begin. Or I'm halfway through and I've got a really great ending. Or there's actually one young man that I'm seeing now who's in year 10. He tells me about 10 different things all at the same time, from the dictators of past years through to world politics. And then he's gaming at the same time and he's jumping all around. But then to try to get him to articulate that onto paper or to narrow it, it's almost an impossibility. His executive function, or we would almost say his executive dysfunction, he just cannot do that. He's not able to just process and know, how do we do this? So the scaffolding needs to be quite specific and broken down. Current statistics in Victoria, and this was taken from Spelled a couple of years ago, and I know Tiffany's going to reference back to this a little at the end, but it's out of our population that it does sit around that 5 to 10% with a persistent, longer, ongoing specific learning difficulty. And I think that this is sometimes like, is that actually helpful or not? I think that there's a lot of factors depending on that. And I'm not going to go into that today. But it's certainly, when we're putting it into the reality of a classroom, that's generally about two, at generous, being 3 kids per classroom. And so that's quite a high, I think that that's actually quite a high number. And certainly I'm very embarrassed to admit, when I went and did my teaching degree all those years ago, I was very naive and ignorant and thinking, I'm not going to have any kids with learning difficulties in my class. That's going to be fine. And yet here I am specializing in this area. So it's quite interesting that my initial ignorance has come back, and it's now my passion to help other families and certainly other educators. As I indicated too, it's trying to help people to avoid that rabbit hole. And we've all done that with our hyper focus on particular areas, or certainly even for myself, just going down, wanting to learn more. And it's almost, the more that I learn, the more I don't understand. And the more I don't understand, the more it becomes overwhelming. And then all of a sudden I'm over a hump and it's like, okay, I've got this. I think that it's trying to simplify your own journeys and not become, it's so easy for me to say don't become overwhelmed, because that's not actually the correct statement, because it's likely that there will be an overwhelm. But it's being able to look at the services and break down that process and empower your knowledge with finding that service and validating your situation, that this is real and there's things that can be done. Forming that trust and having that relationship with the professionals around you, or finding who that is, and really like being able to connect that with fact, as opposed to, oh, here we go, another crackpot mum coming in the door and she's over anxious and she's worried about all of these things. Having knowledge So again, referencing those Ausspell guides is a really great starting point. I think a good place to start, and certainly as Tiffany referenced all those years ago with her daughter, I think that upon that first meeting, it was suggesting for her to have a profile with me. And we went through all of those skills that I indicated earlier and being able to really clearly highlight what's the strengths, what's the gaps. And I'm almost going to have to be scraping the barrel, Tiffany, whether your daughter had a diagnosis of dyslexia or not. It's actually irrelevant from my point of view, but do you remember, had your daughter
We
a diagnosis?
we had seen a psychologist prior to having any intervention, and so they wouldn't give us a diagnosis because we hadn't yet had 6 months worth of intervention. So she got a piece of paper that said she maybe has dyslexia.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
And I
And
think
that's
it's at that point I came to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so that's actually even an interesting point. And it's actually a big fat, what's the word? I was going to say lie. That's too strong. Can we edit this out? But it's basically, it's not the truth that is sitting out there that you don't have to have 6 months of intervention, that it is an indicator of an ongoing persistent difficulty. And I'm
Mm.
looking at collaborating with Raise the Bar to get this message out there because many
Right.
families have been told more recently that they have to have intervention, but that could be in terms of the work that you do with your child at home. It might
Mm.
be the support that they have at school, or even just acknowledging that there's some external services that
Mm.
can help, but that's not the contributing factor. It's showing that it has been longer than a 6 to 12 month kind of difficulty, and that's taken into consideration. I've indicated the University of Melbourne offer the dyscalculia testing, a service like Raise the Bar and Spelled, places that are educational psychologists that can look at those other learning difficulties, or even sometimes some families find it beneficial to even go through somewhere like the Royal Children's Learning Difficulty Clinic. But as I indicated, everyone's going to have their own anecdotal, this is the best, no, this one's the best. It's kind of like it's really tricky to know what is best for you, but it's actually just trying to do your research and find where a place may align with your what you're looking for.
Mm.
These are certainly some credible references, and I apologize for the clarity of the picture. But if people want to take a screen grab of it, or if you know of some of those services, and there's a real list of a whole lot of other organisations that I can provide to Tiffany later. But these are certainly some really good places as a starting point for some of when you're at the beginning of that journey. And they'll also have references and materials and freebies for schools and teachers as well. So just to recap, I think that it's looking out, what do we need to look out for? And as I perhaps haven't really highlighted in the example today, but it's certainly what we definitely prioritize is the emotional well-being of a child above everything. And so again, being asked to speak to school can't, it resonates with our values. That's got to be the above everything. And so if a child isn't regulated and the emotional well-being isn't met, then we need to look at perhaps why and get an understanding. And certainly, where we're sitting in a partnership with looking at what some of those underlying difficulties, it can actually come through for many of our families. There is this underlying learning difficulty, and the emotional well-being sort of unfortunately comes on top of that, and almost, I guess, we get confused by, or not confused, but it's almost like trying to be able to understand what we can do and how we can get back on track. Trusting your gut. And I've been doing this for quite a number of years, and I'm not yet to meet a mum that has got it wrong. And I'd love to actually do a bit of research on that, where that sits in terms of a mother's intuition. It's always been 100%. So if you're out there and something's niggling, maybe it's time to go get some help. Certainly trying to find out what route that you can go on or what options there might be, and certainly to find out about the resources that might suit your family, and definitely ask lots of questions. And I've got our general email if families are wanting to contact us for any further information or we're quite active on all of the social media. So I'm happy to open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Cathy. I'll just share screen again so that people have got those crisis numbers. Just bear with me a second. I'll get that on the screen and then we can chat. I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment, so maybe they're thinking of them just now. I found Dyslexia Victoria Facebook group to be really, really helpful peer support place to find out information and check validity of information and, is this evidence-based or not? And so I recommend I've popped the link for Dyslexia Victoria support into the chat as well. What are some of the things that people should be looking for in terms of you mentioned that it's a bit of a minefield, Cathy, out there. What are some of the red flags you should look out for, or the buzzwords that you might look for that would indicate you might be on the right track?
In terms for around specific learning difficulties or
Yeah,
for
in terms of getting
service?
help, so accessing help, supports that are going to be helpful.
I think that certainly, and I didn't make the reference, and going back to that Ausspell guide, so we flagged it a little bit when we said evidence-based practice. So there's loads of research that is available for on learning difficulties, and interesting enough, it's almost been over about 25 years that we've really known this, and there's still a sluggish approach. Things like synthetic phonics is almost a brilliant starting point for families in the prep to two age groups, and being able to look at explicit instruction and being able to provide, when we talk about almost like multisensory structured literacy, it's not multisensory that let's get out the finger paints and do creative messy play. It's multisensory as in that we're applying. So if we're looking at, say, a word like shop, that we're op. So we're trying to split out the sounds. So we might actually tap it with our fingers, op. So we're bringing in a tactile component, we're saying it, and then we're applying the auditory. So it's kind of like this triangular in the kinesthetic multisensory field, as opposed to, the messy Play-Doh or any of those sorts of things. You would avoid any of that. Looking at certainly some programs, there's quite a number of programs, and certainly at Rookery Road we don't promote a particular program. We're more of a pedagogy and approach. But things like from the La Trobe University, and where that university in particular are coming through with supporting, I'm just trying to think of some of the programs that might be Sounds Right or MSL, multisensory structured literacy, or it might be, I'm going to think, Mass UC. There's a whole list of some very good programs that are out there. It might be considering things like, does your school have decodable books? And so I haven't got any just at hand, but they will be books that follow more that synthetic phonics. So there's a sequential sort of learning. So we're only grouping small amount of letters and sounds, and then gradually and incrementally applying that or building upon that, as opposed to let's give everything all at once, and it's just the cognitive load is too huge. So it's small and it's built for success. Yeah.
I can remember my daughter, it's a profound difficulty with linking the spellings for sounds with the sounds of the sounds, the phoneme and the grapheme together. And once she'd been explicitly taught, I think it was the first 50 of those most common phoneme and grapheme correspondences, her reading took off, and all of a sudden she was reading better than most of the kids in her class who'd been taught whole language, this word recognition method of
Absolutely.
reading. And so they didn't have skills to actually decode unknown words. They only could read the words that they had learned to recognize.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
it's just understanding the mechanics of how the brain learns to read was really important for my daughter to be learning to read. There's a few questions here now, Cathy. Where's a good place to find information on dysgraphia? one of the listeners
Dysgraphia
asked.
specifically, out of the three areas, is a little harder to find, and I might
Mm,
have to try to put my hand on where to go. But again, coming into that Ausspell guide, there will be a
yeah.
list where there's an organisation for that. So if I can come back with that one, that
Mm,
would be okay. Yeah.
sure. And someone asked, are there low cost or free options for assessing for learning difficulties? If you're a low income family, it is very expensive. To go to a education psychologist can cost you over $2,000 for an assessment, can't it, Cathy?
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. And it's
mm,
almost for where if you're looking at things like, say, VCA and getting when children are up in years 11 and 12 and you're wanting to look for accommodations, the kind of the wording that's happening now it's almost that same thing. If there's persistent and like there's been a whole lot of evidence along the track that we've been noticing that there's an area of difficulty for a child that will be determined as opposed to having it formally diagnosed. So it's coming back to
mm,
that concept for your person who asked the question. It's almost like, can a profile substitute that? So uh, for example, for what we've done recently, it's around $400 that will give that profile, but there will be some other places. But even going cheaper than that, yet again, there's readily available for schools. There's a thing called the Dibbles testing. And from a
mm,
reading, and this is for reading, and apologies if we're talking about other areas of difficulty, but a Dibbles test will be able to give almost like a little thermometer check that it's a 1 minute read. So it will look from a decoding accuracy and how many words they can read per minute. And that's just done in 1 minute. Like it's amazing straight away. So if a child is reading, say, for example, 88 words per minute, we can share that with the child to say, is that a good or bad score? It's irrelevant. That's just your score. But we can compare that for that child's age, they should be reading at about 140 words, say, per minute. And then we could look at that. Well, if they're not reading at that same level, that's an indicator. So we need to do something to help that, to read more words. And then for the teacher then to be able to dip into that to unpack that a little bit further. The other one in
yeah.
the pairing of that is the maze test, which is a comprehension test. And all of these are free and they're online. So there are some little things that you can dip into that are free and pretty low costing.
Mm, yeah. And universities often have psych departments too that will do a low cost assessment. But again, there is often a wait list. So if you suspect that there's something going on and you
Yeah.
really, your child's in high school already and you're thinking that you might need the formal assessment, it's good to get on a wait list
Yeah,
sooner
and
rather than later.
they certainly are that they provide, I would say, quite good assessments as an indicator, and yeah, certainly getting onto those lists if you've got time to wait. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone's just popped in the chat. Is refusal or overwhelm when attempting to blend sounds a signal that there may be a learning difficulty specifically? Child already has autism and ADHD diagnosed, along with a speech delay. I'd say yes. What do you think, Cathy? Yeah.
Yes.
Worth
Yes.
investigating.
Yes. Yeah.
Any suggestions for services to reach out for assessment and diagnosis in Queensland, particularly for low income family? Somebody else might have some ideas from the community that's listening today. I don't know of anything specifically in Queensland, do you, Cathy?
Could that person who asked the question, could you narrow it down? Just Queensland is pretty big. So
It is.
is there is there a particular region? I know I have got contacts in Brisbane and a couple of other people in Cairns and Noosa. So it was
Hmm.
quite specific to those areas that.
Okay, all right. Maybe they can tell us a bit more.
Yeah.
Someone's posted here, my 17-year-old son was just identified as having dysgraphia. He's also gifted, apparently, which probably helped disguise the problem for a long time. He was always told to just try harder. Now that we have the diagnosis, I don't seem to be able to find what the next steps should be to support him as he barrels toward HSC. Any recommendations? Yeah, it's that pointy end, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so tricky that I don't know.
Hmm.
I feel like I need you to read the question again, but just for
So
time wise,
dysgraphia
I
and
think that
gifted
it's
student,
what the age,
so
what
they
age?
have a diagnosis, 17.
So
So
in year 10 or 11, it doesn't really matter.
yeah,
I
it doesn't
think
really matter, but
that the bottom line will be going down and trying
assist
to get support for assistive tech.
assistive
100%.
tech is the way to go, isn't it?
It's
So yeah, using
100%.
speech to text, yeah,
Yeah.
and getting
And yeah, and things like even being able to not just only navigate that, say, in the classroom or to use that for an
mm,
efficiency to be able to do your homework or to do the tasks. So there's loads of different sort of apps, but that speech to text having the output,
mm,
but it's actually for those kids who are at that top end, being able to practice with a scribe.
yeah,
So it depends on the school. They may be okay for your child or that child to dictate into a computer had that have has if that has been an ongoing accommodation. But for one of my
mm,
young people that I'm working with in year 10, we hadn't actually negotiated it, but the school just threw her in and had a scribe, and she was like, oh, okay. And so that was a very different skill set, having to
mm,
tell somebody what your
yeah.
ideas are. And so that needs to be probably
It is
explored,
a learned skill,
find
isn't
that
it?
out. Oh, it's
Learning how to use a
extremely hard.
scribe or learning how to use speech to text technology. It's
I
something
mean,
that
I
someone
like,
has to teach you how, and you have to
yeah,
practice
yeah,
using. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I like telling people what to do, but
yeah,
telling them what to write, that might be a different
yeah.
thing altogether.
Yeah. So the person who was asking about Queensland is specifically Brisbane area, please.
Okay,
Just,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. I can perhaps give you,
Maybe if they'd like to email me
yeah,
at
yeah,
School Can't Australia, we can sort that out, can
that sounds good.
provide a recommendation. Are there specific ways we can support learning maths concepts like timetables or time as a parent if you suspect your child has dyscalculia or programs that are evidence-based? What would you
Yeah.
recommend, Cathy?
So Matthew C is fabulous, and almost there might be, without showing my age, but there's a number of people that might remember the good old Cuisenaire rods of the
Hmm.
70s. I'm not suggesting the Cuisenaire rods, but it's that visual with a color, and the little rods will have the lines. So in a lot of schools these days, that will be the MAB blocks that are just that tan neutral. And so it's a bit hard to differentiate between which bits. But the Maths U C has a lovely kit, and it's got all of the materials that help to make it concrete. Because I think with maths, it becomes a very abstract concept. And so, whether it's a formula, and so we want to be able to make it into at least a 2D representation. But before that, they need to solidify the concrete materials. So, certainly,
Mm.
that's one of my go-tos at the moment, or looking at something sort of similar to that. But Maths You See have a lovely component, and they certainly are reaching out for parents to be able to access that material. There's a whole
Yes.
heap of other supports. I feel like I'm doing a disjustice to the maths industry, but it's I can provide you with a list of that. That's some really, really great just freebie and resources. I might put that together and I'll send that through, and then
Oh,
you can
that'd be
check.
great. I can email it out to people
Yeah, yeah,
afterwards. Yeah.
yeah.
So I've just launched a quick feedback survey. If you don't mind just providing us a little bit of feedback about how the session was today, and if you have any ideas about other things, topics that you'd like to see webinars on, please do let us know as well. So we'll finish up there. Thank you so much, Cathy. It's been great to share this hour with you and to have you share your area of special interest and passion
Oh,
with all of us.
you're
So
so welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and certainly wish everyone the best.
thanks.